So g'day everyone and welcome back to the Voice of a Veteran podcast. I know it's been a while, but it's been worth the wait because today I have the one and only Julia Gillard, the 27th Prime Minister for Australia. She was our Prime Minister between 2010 and 2013. And since then, Julia has gone on to do a lot of very exceptional things, and reading through her bio at the moment, it's so impressive from sitting on. She was a director at Beyond Blue and is now the chair of Beyond Blue. Through to very recently, she's been appointed as the chair of Welcome, which is a global charitable foundation which supports science to solve urgent health challenges. There's a whole raft of other honours and accolades, and you come in as a briefing professor. You do so much in the space for women's leadership, and I would probably like to start first and foremost, Julia. Thank you so much for coming on and having a chat with us. How do you like to be known, or how do you like your name to be recognised these days?
Oh, I'm not someone who's ever worried too much about all of that, but I should first start by saying thank you for having me on the podcast. I mean, you can shape those things a bit and then it is what it is, it is what it is. And so, intellectually, I know that people are always going to put the label around me of, Prime Minister, first female Prime Minister. That's the thing that they're going to remember about me most. I don't have an expectation that people would necessarily know all of the things that I'm doing now, though from time to time those things do bob up in the news. I would hope that a bit beyond the formal titles, people might think about me as someone who's been driven by a sense of cause, a sense of purpose across life, who's tried to do some good things. And then I guess it's for others to judge how well or how badly I've achieved those aims.
Absolutely, that's brilliant, and that's a big part of my personal mantra as well. Everything up until now is lived experience, and we used to have this saying when we would hand over the commando berets to those who are qualified, that it comes with a daily renewable contract, and we have to be judged on our actions and attitudes each day forward. But I actually met you nearly 10 years to the month ago, Julia, and one of the most memorable mementos is this is a coin. This is a 4-star general coin that I was your personal security officer on your first trip to Afghanistan in 2011. And that was actually my first trip to Afghanistan as well. And in a meeting later in one of those afternoons, you met with General Allen, who was the commander of the ISAF, so the forces in Afghanistan. And he, in his handshake departing, gave you his 4-star general coin. And on the C-130 flying out of Tarankout back to AMAB, Al Minhad base outside of Dubai, you came and you gave me that 4-star general coin, of which I, for one, could not believe that because that's quite the memento. But two, you were the Prime Minister, and you showed an element, and I want to go into this a bit later. But in that moment, and through a number of moments on that trip, you showed elements of this personality, and particularly this leadership and empathy that I never got to see on the TV. And when I sat there with you, and particularly some of the conversations you had first at Tarankout with some of the Australian and US senior officers, particularly as we were looking at the resourcing and asset requirements as we were looking to draw down out of Afghanistan. And then those conversations you then took up to General Allen, I was so impressed. And I have to really, really say that to you, because I've said that to so many others about you, but I've never said that to you. And the impact you had on me in your personality, and then also in your professional conduct on that very short trip, has left such a lasting impact that looking forward to even just having this conversation with you today, I'm a little bit more nervous than normal.
Well, I don't want you to be more nervous, but thank you for sharing those memories. And I do remember very clearly all those trips to Afghanistan. I took 3 in total. And I was always really conscious. I mean, there was some risk going to Afghanistan, and I was always really conscious that at the end of the day, it wasn't me that was bearing the burden of that risk. It was people like you who were asked to do the security detail. I guess asked isn't the right word. You would have been directed, commanded.
No, we volunteered. It was a prize. It was yourself, and it was the current Governor General, actually, Hurley, on that one trip. It was quite the prize package. He was the Chief of Defence Force back then.
Well, I'm glad you remember it as like that. I've always had this feeling that it would not have been a prize job. It would have been viewed as a risky job and potentially a difficult job because, there you are trying to get someone through. I mean, fortunately, we didn't hit any huge security concerns, but if something big had happened, your job would have been to try and get someone else through and to show a great deal of courage and bravery doing that. So I was always incredibly thankful for that, which would have been the reason that when I was handed the coin, the memento, that I would have thought it was you who deserved to have it more than me at the end of that trip. And I know how much they mean in the military. I do have a number myself from various other engagements, but I know how much they mean in the military. And so I'm glad you've still got it and that it's a very valued possession.
Absolutely. It's a pride of place in the middle there. And those coins, I don't like to get filled up in medals and coins and all sorts of things, but the key part for me is they carry stories like that. And that is one of my most absolute favourite stories. I also remember there's a bit of a prize place when you're flying on those C-130s. There's the cockpit chair. That's the comfortable chair up the front. And I remember all of the senior staff trying to take you up there, and you went up there and had your initial quick look, but then you came straight back down and you started, getting the others, including your staff, to go out there and have a seat. And it's that sort of servant leader characteristics that, again, resonate so strongly with someone like myself who went through, ADFA and RMC. And in my 16 years in the military, that's all you're ever taught is that sort of purpose and service and others before yourself. And I had been in and around other politicians. I'd been there for issues including a lack of hair dryers and whatnot. And to see you then put that, and it wasn't, there were no cameras. There was nothing to be gained other than showing your true and authentic self. And it really was very unique. And again, I don't know if you get enough praise to yourself, but that was really very impactful, particularly on a gung-ho group of young commandos. It's so fascinating to hear the conversations that came out of just how excellent you were in your role and also in your conduct personally throughout that trip.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And I mean, for me, I've always, I guess in my family home, I came from a very ordinary family, a migrant family, but there was that sense. My parents particularly had a very clear sense that you could get the measure of other people, not so much by how they conducted themselves around the powerful, but how they conducted themselves around ordinary people. So my father in particular was the sort of person who, he'd always want to have a chat with the shopkeeper, with the person at the checkout. He'd always want to interact with people in those circumstances. And he definitely had this sense that people who, treat others, if he ever saw someone in a coffee shop being rude to a waiter or something like that, he would be incredibly offended. He couldn't believe that people would conduct themselves like that, and had a real sense of how wrong it was just because you had this little modicum of power because you were the paying customer to lord it over the person who was bringing your food or your coffee. And I think that stayed with me all of my life. It shaped my attitudes.
Absolutely, that great moral upbringing. And in particular, that trip you went over there, that was your first trip to visit to Afghanistan, and that came on the 29th of October. There were actually 3 Australians killed, including one of my classmates, Bryce Duffy, and your trip was the week after. And again, probably the biggest thing that does resonate with me was when you went and gave an address to the people on the ground there at the Poppies Cafe. And before then, I'd seen you on TV giving quite prepared speeches and in your official political role. And you spoke without notes, and you spoke from the heart. And I particularly remember we then got in the car afterwards, and you caught me off guard because you asked, "How was that, Heston?" And I said, "Ma'am, that was brilliant. I sort of wish we'd heard you speak like that more often." And you gave me a bit of an explanation of how a lot of the things in Parliament were very prepared speeches and things like that. But again, we saw you as a bit of a fish out of water over there with roller bags and all these sort of things. And next thing you were leading from the front, so it was really, really brilliant to see, and really brilliant to see that personality shine through. And you can definitely tell it came from a brilliant moral upbringing. It wasn't put on; it was actually the authentic you. So anyway, what I would like to do, Julia, is you've mentioned beforehand a bit of your upbringing. I'd really like to speak in this podcast about the key transitions in life. So the whole reason why I stepped up Voice of a Veteran and this podcast is the mental health and suicide crisis been going on in the veteran community. But in particular, the crisis for me is whenever anyone isn't able to achieve their true potential. That then comes with mental health decline, that comes with external and internal factors. And in my own journey, I found so much of what was holding me back ended up being myself. But in particular, speaking to someone like yourself who's been through such huge transitions in your life, transitioning into politics, being the first female Prime Minister, and then leaving politics and life since then, I'm really, really keen to talk to you about a few of those things. Like we said before, that sort of real sense of purpose and starting with that sort of reason why you wanted to enter into politics.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it wasn't a blinding flash of light. I get asked about why I went into politics a fair bit, and I wish I had some dramatic story of, there was one moment when the vision came to me, but unfortunately, it's not like that. It's, more a step and then a step and then a step. And so, I was interested in current affairs in politics because they were discussed in my family home. I went to university. I got involved in a student campaign, pretty modest thing, but a student campaign about federal government funding cutbacks, which I thought were quite wrong. Education was very valued in my family home, and anything that sort of got in the way of someone's access to education seemed to me to be morally wrong things. So I got swept up in that campaign. I obviously showed some capacity in it, and people started saying, oh, you should run for this or that or the other position in student politics. And I did do that. And then at every stage, I got to be, a local campus official, and then a regional official, and then a national official. And at every stage, I had that sense, this is probably it. This is the most I'll do. This is the most I can do. This will be the last thing I do. And then as you did it, you got the sense, no, maybe I can do a bit more. And then you take the next step. And really, that's sort of my story of the birth of the ambition to go into politics, that it took me a long time to think of myself as the sort of person who could do it. But once I got that sense that I could, I knew I wanted to. And once, I had worked out that this was the pathway, then I got very stubborn and determined about it. So I wasn't, once I made up my mind, I was no longer, wistful or half-hearted about it. I was very, very stubborn and determined about it. And I needed to be like that, because between me deciding that I would like to be in the federal parliament and actually getting there, that journey is measured in years and in failed pre-selection attempts and a failed election attempt. So if you'd been faint-hearted, you wouldn't have kept going.
Gotcha. And as you were explaining, going up through those sort of levels, those false crests or those false ceilings, was part of the realization that, hey, I can do this, I can keep going, or it's, hey, I can do more? Was there a bigger piece, you wanted to change the world, or was it just also growing in your own confidence and realizing what you actually were capable of?
I think it's more growing in my own confidence and my own ability to fit into those shoes. Growing up, it's not like we knew people in politics well or anything like that. I mean, neither of my parents finished secondary school. So it's not like you grew up in an environment where you knew that you could fit in all of these different pathways in life. I mean, we were taught aim high, think big, think about going into the professions. I was a high school debater, so everybody said to me, you should be a lawyer, all of that sort of stuff. So it wasn't that there were forces stunting my ambition or my sister's ambition, but there's a difference between being told you can do it and then actually getting a mental image of yourself in that place. And, I think particularly growing up as, a girl, getting a mental image of a woman being in those places was harder than it would have been perhaps for a young boy to get an image of a man being in those places, because those images were readily available. And so it's partly your own skills, your own confidence, but partly just that sense that this isn't a job for some sort of, superhuman group of people who I haven't met yet, but they must exist, and they're the kind of people who go and do this. And then there's ordinary people like me, getting a sense that actually it is sort of ordinary people who work hard, who think about it, who develop their skills, who end up going into these positions. And once I got all of that together in my head, then I wanted to do it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. It's such a common story when I speak to people who've gone to that elite level like yourself, that so much of that, probably actually to your credit, is wondering if you're ready or waiting until you're ready. And then once you actually start sort of chipping away at those things, really appreciating what you can do. And I've watched the series Misrepresented, and I think it's brilliant. I learned so much actually, in my ignorance going along through that. And as you said beforehand, just even having what we call the lead scout, people who've gone before you to actually provide you with a little bit more certainty that it is achievable. I mean, you were truly quite the scout yourself, and it really helps set a lot of precedents for others to follow. And so much of that comes from usually what people do to prepare themselves for that. And I find this, particularly as we talk about you becoming the Prime Minister of our country, and another podcast I did with another politician, the statement was, you don't need to be qualified to be a politician. It's one of the only jobs in the country you don't need to be qualified. But there's so much that goes into a person and a professional to be able to perform to that elite level. So I'm so interested in your own personal and professional preparation to become essentially the Prime Minister of our country.
Yeah, once again, I think that's a journey in stages. And so, if you'd asked me when I was going into the federal parliament, what's the thing you'd like to achieve when you were here? I would have said, look, if I could get to be a minister for education or a minister for workplace relations in a Labor government, that would be fantastic. That would be a dream come true. So I did go in with an ambition about being a government minister. But, firstly, I was just delighted to be there. I'd fought hard to come through for pre-selections. I'd run for the election for the seat of Lawler. So you're practicing all your skills about community outreach and campaigning and understanding the issues that are on people's minds and thinking about the policy solutions that might make a difference. I'd worked as a high-level political staffer. I was John Brumby's chief of staff when he was leader of the opposition in Victoria, so that had helped my skill base. So by the time I got in there, I felt ready, but there was still lots of things to learn about Parliament. You can watch it from the outside, but to be on the parliamentary floor in question time, in debates, getting familiar with parliamentary committees, with what the Labor caucus does, all of that was a big learning experience. And so I spent that first parliamentary term sort of drinking it all in. And then by the time of the second parliamentary term, thought, I was ready to take the step into the shadow ministry. We were still in opposition. And I fortunately did get an opportunity to do that because the leader, Simon Crean, was very interested in renewal and new people coming forward. And so you learn to do that. And I got ever more senior portfolios as we were in opposition, ultimately leading opposition business, which means you lead the parliamentary tactics. And then I was deputy opposition leader before the 2007 election. So you go through all of that. And then, to use your terminology, there's another crest, and the next crest is, getting to be familiar with what it's like to be a government minister and to actually have levers of power in your hand. And I did have that experience as Deputy Prime Minister. I had a number of experiences acting as Prime Minister whilst Kevin went to do overseas work. And so by the time I became Prime Minister, whilst it was still a jump, it wasn't a jump from the ground to the mountaintop. You'd already been sort of, getting your way up there. Gotcha.
So there's a lot of on-the-job training. I'm just intrigued. Is there any actual formalized training along the way? Because I've only had some brief insights this last year, and every politician essentially has their own small team of staff, so they're seen as a small team leadership role. Through to ministers have their growing staff, and then as you go up and up and up, that team gets bigger. So there's a lot of that on-the-job training which can only sort of get from within the politics itself, but there's also this sort of leadership role and this management role. I'm sort of intrigued to see, you've obviously learned a lot of that along the way, and you speak a lot to that very eloquently and very in depth. And I've listened to a lot of that at the moment. I'm just sort of intrigued as to, is that all just through your own lived experience, or did you do professional leadership study along the way? Did the party develop you in that way?
There is surprisingly little formal training, actually far too little. Yeah. Look, I can't hand on heart say it's still definitely like this, because there may have been some things introduced since I've left the Parliament that I'm not aware of. But
just for you leading up to being Prime Minister, yeah.
Yeah, surprisingly little. No, the party did. I mean, the party did media training and things like that to help you. So as a candidate and then as a new backbencher, there are training things that are done. So the party did some candidate training, some media training, but that was really about you as a politician and how you interacted with the world and your community. The Parliament had a sort of new members training course that we all went on in mixed groups. So they would put the political parties together and you'd go on the training courses together, which was good, I think, to build at least some understanding across the Parliament. So that happened, but no ongoing access to training, no real training about what it means to be an administrator, a manager, a leader of a team. That you just learned organically, or you didn't. And unfortunately, I think politics shows many people don't learn it on the job, or don't learn it well enough, and make hideous errors as a result.
I find it so fascinating from a personal side of the house, because when I first joined the military in 2003, I spent the first 4 years just down the road, 3 years at the Australian Defence Force Academy, and then 1 year at the Royal Military College. So I had to undertake 4 years worth of professional officer training, which included so much leadership and management or authority responsibility training before we were even allowed to have our first group, our first platoon. And while I absolutely love the way in which Parliament is designed to represent all Australians, I would love to go in there tomorrow I finished the last year of my career running the Special Forces Selection Course for Commandos. And you can imagine I had an amazing team that included so many fantastic contractors, some of which currently work with the Australian Institute of Sport and support of the athletes going over for the Olympics. And just to be able to go in there and actually better support some of the current and future generations of politicians with some of this stuff, that it's hard. I love that you said you got the media training, because it seems like that's what a lot of the primary focus is. But it's literally hard to be able to do all of this specialist skill set you're required to do. And then also, you have your team and you're within an environment where, from what I can understand, it's not exactly always the best team environment. There are individual ambitions in there. And my ignorance going into this place thinking, a party of 60 sitting members, they're all getting together and having discussions sometimes, but that's not always the case. Yeah.
No, so, sometimes it's like that, and sometimes it's not. And I mean, you would have had this experience doing commando selection. There's a lot of times that you end up having to, break people's hearts. You would have had to have said to, young people who were absolutely desperate to be selected that, I'm sorry, but you haven't made the grade. And the more senior you get in politics, actually, the more of that hard stuff you do. As Prime Minister, one of the things you do is you assemble the ministerial team, and more people want to be ministers than are going to end up getting an opportunity. And so you end up disappointing people. The problems that come to you that end up on your desk are the too hard basket. No one comes in with, Prime Minister, here's a blindingly easy decision. Why don't you make this one? If it's blindingly easy, then someone else has made it 10 steps before it ever got anywhere near the Prime Minister. The only ones that actually get in the door are the ones that are really hard, and where you'll be, creating happiness for some because they're pleased with the decision, but probably going to be disappointing others. And you're not given any training in managing that either. That's all organically done, whereas I guess you were prepared for all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Came through quite the professional system. And that's where I really do actually sympathise with just actually appreciating how difficult that is. And I'm very keen to sort of touch on and better understand if it was a consideration of yourself, like your own support network, but mental health and awareness of mental health. I like to call it mental fitness, like I'll call this session with you here today is actually my mental fitness session. I think we save these things up too much, but what we don't realize is just like exercising or doing push-ups, our mental health is real and needs to be supported and addressed. And I'm very keen, particularly during that situation where you're learning so much on the go, you're promoting up the ranks in authority and responsibility and all these other interesting dynamics. How did you go about looking after yourself, or what was your approach to looking after yourself? Was it a priority? Or did you realise it? When did you realise?
Yeah, I did realise that it had to be a priority, in that first parliamentary term. So, you're the bright-eyed new backbencher and you want to do everything and you want to go to everything in your electorate and you want to volunteer for every committee and you want to run around the nation doing all of the things associated with the committee. And then you'd, look down at your diary and realise that you'd worked, 40, 50 days straight. And you ultimately had to say to yourself, and I did say to myself that, this is, something I want to do for years, not for 3 years and then fall over exhausted. This is something I want to do for years. And as hard as it's going to be, I need to think about how I'm going to stay fit, healthy, in the right zone in a mental wellness sense, mental fitness sense, to do my best at this. And I think for me, some of that was intuitive. I think, even measuring this journey, I first went into Parliament in the, 1990s, the late 1990s. The dialogue between now and then about mental health has just, exploded. There are so many resources around now that you could pull into this sort of personal setting of how you're going to live, which weren't available then. So it was a more intuitive process. But I always got it that if I didn't nurture some of the relationships that were closest to me, family and friends, if I didn't have that support base, if I sort of allowed that to kind of wither or die, that would be a huge problem. I always got it that if I didn't have enough sleep, enough rest and recovery, that would end badly, and that I did need, just decompression, personal time where you would maintain some physical fitness and where you would do things that just gave you a bit of joy and a bit of relief. And for me, that's things like reading books. I like to read novels and stuff like that. And so, you try and get a little bit of that into your diary and to learn the tricks of going from full speed ahead to dead stop as quickly as possible to manage those transitions.
Yeah, I could particularly, I would love to have a bit more conversation about that in particular, living such a high impact public life. I've just only had some little glimpses through this Royal Commission period and whatnot. And sometimes in my own journey, I've actually found some of the hardest times to be when all of a sudden it goes quiet, when there's no one calling, when there's no one asking for something. I'm sure it was probably quite different for you where there were the times to breathe, but in particular those sort of quiet times, unless we've got that support network established around us, it's very easy for us to sort of start identifying a few ceilings or a few false crests that we didn't see before. And do you, even when you were Prime Minister, Julia, did you have anyone sort of helping you with things like fitness and nutrition, with these things that go into this holistic sort of health and wellness that we know so much about now?
I had a personal trainer who would come to the lodge and we would do yoga and exercises together, a wonderful woman called Tanya. And she was, a great fitness trainer in the physical sense, but also someone from the outside world to have a conversation with about how you were thinking and feeling. And so that was a lot of relief. So she was a great support to me. On nutrition, no, but I guess I, sort of already kind of had the basics in my mind about what it is to eat well. And, you do end up, it's actually a weird world really, because There are lots of times as a politician, you really don't make any of your own food choices because you're the speaker at a dinner, or you're visiting the local, aged care facility, and they're putting on a morning tea for you. And so you end up, eating whatever people are giving you rather than making big choices about what do I want to eat that would be best for my body. But when I could make those decisions, I think I knew enough about nutrition to make some good decisions.
It's so
hopefully.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, you've done well, and you're radiating on the other side of this camera, so you obviously keep doing well.
A bit of junk food got eaten too. I don't want to paint the past too glamorously. There were plenty of times we were in the Prime Ministerial office eating chips and stuff like that, let me assure you.
A bit of the sugar or salt rush to help you out with some of those late nights. It's just
right.
Fascinating for me, how much effort we put into elite athletes, and essentially, you guys up there were making decisions about nations and global decisions, and again, I like to take that same team in there and help set people up with personal trainers that become therapists as well, through to that nutrition routine. Absolutely. Anyway,
it would be wonderful to see.
Yeah.
It'd be a revolution.
As you know, particularly one of the most sedentary jobs up there during those sitting weeks, from some of those, some of them nearly go to bloody midnight when there's a lot of debate, or not boulder dashing. What do they call it when you just keep talking to where the time's on?
Maybe it should be called boulder dashing, but the term is filibuster. But I quite like boulder dash.
I remember the first, when we were looking to get this motion for the Royal Commission passed through, I remember one of Jackie Lambie's staff came through and was like, no, they're filibustering for the rest of the day. I'm like, what is this filibustering? He's like, they're just going to fill up the time. I was like, they're allowed to do that? It's like, yes, it's a tactic. Like, who came up with that bloody word? Anyway, I digress. So I love to get this narrative. Your transition into politics, you were definitely there filled with a sense of purpose. That was the impact you could have. And along the way, you've really had to learn a lot on the job, personally and professionally. But the biggest transition in life, and the most public transition in life that you've had, that I'd love to dive into, is that transition out of being Prime Minister. That obviously did not come at a time of your own choosing. And for many, right across the country, particularly, I really want to push this towards the mental health and wellness and fitness takeaways. I'd really love to talk to you about what that was like for you personally, and sort of what you went through when we've spoken about some of these regimes and structures and support networks you had in place, and whether you found those adequate, or how you had to pivot personally and professionally, and what you've learned from that subsequently.
Yeah, it was, obviously it was an incredibly difficult time. Immediately after, immediately after losing, we went and had a very hefty drink, if the truth be told. We had lots of people swamped to the lodge and sort of drink and commiserate into the night. And then, all had to go to Parliament the next day. But, as the transition moved on, I was very keen. You have a team that's really, really close to you who's also bearing the shock and the hurt. I was very keen that team, both political staff but also parliamentarians who'd been very close to me, didn't take on the burden of my leaving, that they needed to, get on and make choices about what was best for them, and not carry that with them. And some of them had to make very immediate choices. Would they go and work on Kevin's team as he came back as Prime Minister? And I was always very keen to say to people, you've got to make whatever you feel inside you, but don't make this decision for me. Don't have a sense that you've got to spurn an opportunity, otherwise that's not being loyal to me. You do what's best for you. So there was a sort of a bit of a pastoral care element that kind of sustained me a bit. But there was also a lot of sadness in the leave taking, because there's lots of people who are in your world as Prime Minister who will probably go on to serve the next Prime Minister. police officers that do the protection work when you're in Australia, who you're with all day, every day. You get very close to the staff at the lodge who you've basically lived alongside, the staff in Parliament House, the senior public servants that you've spent all of these intense hours with. And so there was a lot of leave taking. And once that had been done, I felt, I went home to Altona. Tim and I went back to our home in Altona, and I just needed to be in my own space, basically incredibly quiet. One of the things that it felt with the leave taking is people completely lovely and very upset on your behalf, which is generous of them. But if you do it time after time after time, that kind of leave taking, you start to get the sense that you're living through your own funeral. It's like, I can't do this continuously. And so I had to just have a period of quiet time. And the rhythm of sort of politics was going to give me a period of quiet time as well, because there was the election campaign. And I knew if I was seen anywhere during the election campaign, the media would have beaten that up, to use it as a distraction from the campaign Kevin was running. So I didn't want any of that to happen. So I just literally stayed in Altona, snuck out for walks, very quiet. And it's in that period that the sort of amount of adrenaline and stress and tension that you've been carrying really comes home to you. It's that, I think it's a pretty common phenomenon. I think a lot of people would experience it. They, work like a demon all year, get to their Christmas holidays, think this is going to be fantastic. And then the second day of your Christmas holidays, you wake up with a sore throat, and it's kind of your body getting you back for that year that you've, flogged it. Well, I had that sort of times 1,000. So honestly, I think every day of those, weeks, I would have woken up saying to myself, oh, my shoulder hurts. Oh, my throat's a bit sore. Oh, I feel like I've got a bit of a headache. It was just like the physical outworking of the tension. It was incredible, really. And so, you needed to physically recover, and then you needed to sort of psychologically recover. And for me, that was, I needed absolute quiet. And then out of that absolute quiet, I then moved into the sort of decision-making cycle of what do I absolutely know I want to do next, and what do I absolutely know I don't want to do, and then how long can I live with the shades of grey about what might be in the middle. So I made some decisions about things I didn't want to do, some things about just that I did, and then, over the year or so that followed, year and a bit, went about shaping my new life. And obviously opportunities have come to me across the years that have followed.
It's fascinating. Particularly you're talking about the body ailments. It's so interesting, the effect that stress and cortisol and all that can have on you. And that, but what it sounded like, you essentially went and self-isolated, went out for walks, kept below the
I did.
radar. Yeah, had your own lockdown.
If Daniel Andrews had been articulating COVID rules back then, I would have been abiding by them. I wouldn't have been more than 5Ks from my home, that's for sure.
What I particularly love about that story, Julie, is you talk about those first elements of your experience, actually about others and about all those in your immediate team that you've had those personal connection with, and essentially were sort of directly or indirectly a huge part of your daily support network. And while they're not there, giving you advice, they're there providing you with some form of comfort and some part of your identity. And a huge part of that transition for being Prime Minister is, you were Prime Minister Julia Gillard, and now you're back to being Julia Gillard. And I'm so intrigued to ask more on that potential loss of identity, or what you sort of went through in this, what so many others do and so many others fail at, this reinvention place after you've sort of gone into your isolation and then contemplating, who you are or what you are next, or whether you already had that to assist you in that process moving forward.
Yeah, I think I had some advantages coming to this task of reinventing. I mean, number one, I hadn't set out as a 5-year-old to be Prime Minister. So it wasn't like, my whole identity had been developed around, I must have this top job. So I think some people live with the burden of that. They've set that aspiration very, very early and, either don't achieve it because not many people get to become Prime Minister, or do achieve it, and when they lose it, then that's a very hard knock. I didn't have that same sense about it. And I always had this sense as Prime Minister that you knew you were the Prime Minister, you had all of the trappings that come with being Prime Minister, you had all of the responsibilities that come with being Prime Minister. But I also didn't want to wear that heavily. I wanted to interact with people as naturally as I could, despite all of that. And so the putting of the formalities aside, I think, didn't therefore cost me as much as it might have cost others who relied on those formalities more to shape how they interacted with the world. And I don't know the answer to this. I really don't. It's just something I muse on. But being the only woman to do the job, I'm not a believer that men and women's brains are wired differently. I think a lot of that, is just pop science, and it's not true. But we're certainly socialised differently. And, from the earliest days, I think women are socialised more to, not put their whole identities on ambition. If anything, we tend to teach girls that ambition, being too nakedly ambitious is not a good thing for a girl to be. And I think we should stop doing that. But one of the things from female socialisation with the expectation you'll put the needs of others before the needs of self, I think maybe when you come to some of these big life transitions, there's a bit less sort of capital E ego in it than there is for men who may well have been socialised into, if you don't achieve, then, that is not acquitting an appropriate definition of manhood. Manhood is defined around achievement.
Absolutely. I mean, you're preaching to the choir. I love everything you've just said then, and particularly, not separating identity from position or title. That's something that so many of us struggle with. That's something I personally struggle with, and a really huge sort of golden nugget you said there beforehand was that whole not having your identity already premeditated affixed to being Prime Minister. And in particular in, sort of the veteran context, just to provide sort of data to really reinforce that statement and that realisation is that one of the largest demographics of mental health decline and suicide is actually some of those people who end up going through the basic training or the initial training during defence and either don't meet the requirements or medically withdrawn due to injury. And you can potentially imagine people like, in their 17, 18, 19, their first sort of step out of schooling and into adulthood, and they've had this focus on this, and it was already a derivative of their identity. They're telling people I'm going to go join the military and all this, and then the first real adult identity they've affixed themselves to emotionally and mentally is then removed from them. And they're found to be either inadequate or just unable to achieve that. And that's really that critical period where we just find so many of our suicide areas spiking, and in particular, so much of that mental health decline when it's not realised. So what you were saying there is you've sort of always been able to have essentially a higher purpose by the sounds of it. There's quite this sort of acts of service. And have you read the book, The Love Languages, by any chance?
No, I haven't. I'll have to put it on the list.
It's good. It's just a very quick vignette. I got introduced to it by a fantastic high performance coach we had who came in and gave us some briefings. A female, she was fantastic during my time at the Commandos, and replaced the word love with the word value. And there's basically 5 different languages that we show value and receive value. For instance, I show value through acts of service. I love doing things for people. And one thing in particular that COVID sort of taught me was actually that my love language, the way I receive love, is actually just quality time. People who like to be around me without having to do things. Whereas previously I thought it was words of affirmation. I thought I needed to hear from people. But sort of really what you've demonstrated there is first and foremost, you really show and feel value through what you can do for others in particular. but also not being wedded to only being able to do that based on a position or a profile or a title that you had. And I think that's really bears itself in exactly what you're doing now. Like I said, there's a couple of paragraphs on my screen of all the ways you've gone on to still achieve amazing things. And in particular, this is why I find your position so fascinating, because I have spoken to others who have gone from elite level of support, so elite levels of sport, elite levels of corporate, elite levels of politics themselves, and sort of find them still looking back and wishing and wondering what was and wanting to get back in the game, whereas you've still gone on to make your impact and make a change on the world. So in particular, it's so fascinating how you've gone on to do that and where that sort of mental resolve and purpose came from, and where in particular that community around you, where that changed, what those sort of the building blocks were that you could give advice to those listening to this, going through the smallest through to the largest transitions in their life, from the lessons that you've learned through lived experience.
Yeah, I think one thing I'd certainly say, and, you know, when I talked about that period in Altona where I decided I did want to do some things, and I knew I did want to pursue causes that, you know, had been close to my heart, particularly education. And by February of the next year, I was being asked to become the chair of the Global Partnership for Education. I knew I wanted to write, that I wanted to write a book about my time in politics, and I knew I wanted to do that quite quickly because I thought it would be best to get it down as a, you know, contemporaneous, or as near as possible contemporaneous account. Mm-hmm. But as important as it was to shape some of those things, the profound decision I think I made in that period was what I was not going to do. And I decided then, very clear line, that what I wasn't going to do is I wasn't going to involve myself any longer in Australian domestic politics. So I wanted to, you know, put a kind of full stop. So during the period of the election campaign, I did write a piece about politics and the future of politics for the Future of Labor, which was published after the election. And having done that, then obviously there were some political comments in the book, but I decided very strongly that I wouldn't be popping up in the day-to-day domestic political debate. And I made that decision because I thought it was right for my political party not to have a sort of former Prime Minister looming up, you know, saying you should be doing X or Y or Z. That was for the people who were in the seats, you know, holding the responsibilities at that moment, you know, so for Albo and the team now. But I also knew it would be better for me that you put in a kind of clean break with the past. Yep. And one of the things that informed that choice for me is when I was a lawyer all those years ago, I used to do employment law, and you would literally have people come in with, you know, folders and booklets that they'd written that they were carrying. They'd stagger into your office, you know, put it on your desk and say, oh, look, you know, I had this big employment dispute. It started 15 years ago and it was really unfair. And then they'd tell you about it. And maybe it had been really unfair, but, you know, often things aren't fixable, even with legal solutions. There wasn't a legal solution, and they'd spent the 15 years obsessing about it. And you were there to give them legal advice, but what you really wanted to say was, you know what you should do? You should take that, take it home, put it, you know, make a little fire outside, burn it, and, you know, obviously safely, burn it all and just put it out of your head and get on with the rest of your life, because you could be obsessing about this for the next 30 or 40 years, or you could go on and happily live the next bit of your life. And so I guess in that quiet time, you know, you end up sort of staring at these things and staring at what you've told others. And it was time to take some of my own advice. And so that has been a lot better for me to just, you know, I do reflect back personally, but I don't get out there in the public domain. And that means that I look at what I'm doing now and I look ahead.
Yeah, well, as you would know, a lot of that comes from that trauma, like you explained, that gentleman. You could imagine the amount of, you know, even Vietnam veterans through to veterans much older than me who've carried these traumas through them to now. And you have to go back and sort of dig these up and go through that grieving process. And it's so fascinating that you have, gone forward with such dignity. And I really do respect your decision to not be popping up, as you say. Whereas at the same time, even watching you on that documentary and hearing how articulate you are and seeing your work around the place, it's not like you're deliberately being silent. You're just really focusing on, what you can do, what only you can do right here and now. And do you still? We have this saying of, I know myself, looking back at how some of the younger officers and all this are trained these days, I find it very hard sitting on the sideline. I find it very hard going from being a player to sitting on the sideline. And that's not like, I can do it better. Sometimes you just want to get there and help. And, that sometimes the hardest part is, like you said, identifying what you're not going to do as opposed to what you want to do. And how did you deal with that personally?
Yeah, I look, there are sometimes I'd have to say I'm wandering around muttering.
Good.
I'll see something on TV and I'll be muttering to myself about what the government should be doing or what the Labor opposition should be doing. So yes, that does happen. But I don't take my muttering apart from people obviously, looking at me oddly if you're talking to yourself. But I don't take that. Yeah, I don't take it further. And I'm still in contact with political colleagues, but I work on the basis, they know where I am. If they want to pick my brains, they want some advice, they've got the phone number, they'll pick up the phone. That's the better way round than me either speaking publicly or me ringing in saying, you haven't thought about X or you should be doing Y. And I also know, it's even if you read the media and all the rest of it, it is still hard to see political problems from all angles unless you're actually in the middle of it. And so in some ways, the best advice I can give, if people seek it, is not what you should do about today's news story. It's the perspective that comes with being, 20 steps back, 30 steps back, so you've still got the political analytical skills, but you're not right in the middle of it. And sometimes that enables you to see the bigger picture in a way that it's harder for the day-to-day professionals who are right in the mix of it. And so if people ring me, that's the kind of conversation I tend to have.
That's brilliant. Very hard to step out of that anxiety circle these days, isn't it? And actually get a bit of perspective. What is your purpose these days, Julia? What drives you and what is driving you tomorrow?
Well, I think I'm still a cause-driven person. So my causes continue to be mental health, of course, with Beyond Blue, still very driven by what I would call the politics of opportunity, that artificial things, discriminatory things do not hold people back. And that is what has informed my work in education and my work on women's leadership. And in this world where we can have odd debates about whether you can pick your own facts, and we're having some of those debates in the context of the pandemic, I'm very attracted to what I'm doing now at Wellcome, which is being an advocate for science and the role it can play in informing how we make decisions to solve some of the biggest problems in our world. And Wellcome's strategy is about discovery science, but it's also about infectious diseases, mental health and climate change. And if you had to band together, three big issues of our age, then I think they're the three big ones for right now. And of course, they're interrelated, mental health, infectious diseases, the pandemic, all of these things go hand in hand.
Absolutely. You don't like picking up small causes, do you?
No, still doing things that I'm passionate about. And look, I like to write, and that explains why I did the book last year on women and leadership. And I don't have any contemporary plans to write, but I'm not ruling it out for the future either. I might write again.
Gotcha, good. What about your own support network? Outside of causes and outside of I know as well how great writing can be, and I'm still yet to read all of your work, but it's on the list. I'm sorry, I'm the worst reader in the world for concentration. But what do you do as far as your own personal routine outside of, again, profession and causes, and also the support network you have around you, and how that sort of changes and transitions still, or is it firmly set?
Look, it's still much the same, in the sense I rely profoundly on my family and friends because I travel, in the days you could travel. I travelled very extensively pre-COVID, and, my life is now partly London, partly Australia, and I set up this life when you could quickly get between the two on a plane. Obviously, that's not the world we live in now. No, quickly getting between the two on a plane. What that has meant is, I'm reliant on family and friends in more than one place. So I'm in the happy situation where I've got some truly great friendships here in London, which are very important to me, as well as all of my family and friends back home. And then, just getting balance as best as I can into my life. And that's easier for me now. I mean, I think I still work hard, but it's not the sheer relentlessness that politics was. So carving out time to, do things that I find restorative, reading, visiting art galleries, going to the theatre, things like that when I can, walking outside. Last week I did some walks in Wales. I find those sorts of things, very restorative, and, just making sure that I sleep well and eat well.
Absolutely. And doing lots of your own podcasts.
And doing lots of my own podcasts. I think it's I really enjoy recording them, and I enjoy listening to them. I've become quite a podcast and audio book person as I wander around walking in London frequently, listening to something. And there's real intimacy, I think, about listening into other people's conversations that podcasting gives you.
Absolutely. And your podcast is called A Podcast of One's Own, and that's in your role as the chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. And again, I would highly recommend that to anyone listening. Someone who's been professionally trained and educated and continuously in leadership. There's the first rule of leadership is you're never too old to learn, or there's never enough that you can't learn. And it's been really fascinating hearing that. And even doing some of these podcasts myself, just the conversations you have and some of the information that you're able to communicate or even realize that's in there, just having these conversations. I'm really, really impressed. And I could just imagine how much some of that, and even just some of the frank and open and authentic conversations you're having on your podcast is brilliant. A lot of people would expect someone to be, sort of that air of authority, or at least trying to maintain some form of, I don't know, inauthenticity, I call it. I don't know why people try and do it, but you really get in there for some of those conversations. So I really commend you on that, and encourage others who are listening to this to have a listen to it. A podcast of one's own.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I've really enjoyed turning the tables and being interviewer, having been someone who's been interviewed so much. And I actually think, and you're very good at it, I think good podcasting is as much about the quality of leaving the silence as it is about asking the questions, giving your guests as much scope as they need. That's what, at the end of the day, makes it a podcast that takes you to another level, because people have got the space to have the deeper conversation. Yeah,
absolutely. And just in that theme of leadership and everything you continue to learn, any key lessons, key takeaways that you've learned from being the highest level of leader to now? What I say, the art of being a great leader is knowing how to be a great follower as well. In your own lived experience, again, I bang on about these things, but very rarely do we get to hear it from someone like yourself, what you've learned and what you would tell young leaders of all ages, genders, and everything else in between.
Yeah, I think even from my earliest days, I knew that being clear about your own sense of purpose was a key, that, in a crowded, contested world where things press in on you, unless you were very clear about your true north, you'd get buffeted off course very easily. So I talk to young people about that, about their sense of purpose, about developing it, not just intuiting it, but actually getting out a sheet of paper, writing it down, polishing it, so that you've really got clarity around what's driving you. What became increasingly clear to me across the journey is how much of a sense of self you've got to have. You've got to know a lot about yourself, your strengths and weaknesses, but you've also got to be, prepared to listen to constructive criticism from others, but not take all of it on board if it's just kind of flibbity-gibbet stuff. And obviously politics.
We're gonna take that flibbity gibbet. I like that. Good.
Flibbity gibbet. Yeah. A lot of politics brings you the flibbity gibbet stuff. Okay. And then the thing I've learned along the way is don't sweat the small stuff. I used to be the complete perfectionist about everything, and you get to the stage where you know what, the world won't end if you miss that train, get somewhere a little bit late, don't do that email until tomorrow. You can give yourself a little bit of respite when you need.
You're right. Very, very great words. Thank you for that. Particularly, so much of that comes down to this, people harp on about authenticity and vulnerability, and particularly that, sense of self, understanding who you really are, and not being able to be so impacted by what others think. Where did that come from for you?
Look, I think it's more in the zone of a muscle rather than an inherent trait. I think I was someone who, in my earliest days, if I go back to school and that kind of stuff, would have been very, very sensitive to the criticism of others. And then, as I moved into this more publicly exposed world, you did have to get, people talk about it as a thicker skin, but I think it's actually more discernment about what matters and you really need to listen to and could make a big impact and is a criticism with truth at its heart versus what's sort of capricious and cruel and you just can't let get in your head.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually appreciating, first and foremost, knowing what the truth is inside you. So it's not a thicker skin, it's sort of that water off a duck's back, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. That's right. Water off a duck's back, I think, is right. You just you can't. And you don't have to be that publicly exposed these days for to see really bad things about yourself. Lots of people would see that on social media. Lots of young people would, lots of young women in particular would see horrible things about themselves on social media. And you do have to, nurture a sense of self which enables you to view that as water off a duck's back and not take it all in.
Absolutely. The social media piece, I have this sort of saying, it's just this entire element for inauthenticity to creep in. We compare ourselves to our last post, to our last stories, much like some people compare themselves to their last position or their last title. It's so easy to build that daily inauthenticity, but it's just brilliant here sitting and talking to you and hearing that inner radiance that you definitely know, your sense of self, and particularly your work now with Beyond Blue. I'd love to hear more about that and particularly how that's impacted you and how you continue to look at mental health and the importance in this space and in every Australian space, because I really feel that the true pandemic we're about to face is the mental health decline. That is the slow onset post this sort of physical pandemic, and the importance of that, and also some of the work that Beyond Blue is doing. We see a lot of it in the media, but not a lot of people actually truly know what is going on. And now you're the chair. It'd be great to hear it from you yourself.
Yeah, sure. This has been an extraordinary time for everyone, but also an extraordinary time for Beyond Blue. So literally the Beyond Blue staff, many of them cancelled their Christmas holidays in the summer between 2019 and 2020 because of the bushfires and the mental health load that came with that, and, calls flooding into our support service and people needing assistance. And then as that was starting to ease and people were like, okay, we can take a breath now, we moved into the pandemic, and the Beyond Blue statistics just show incredibly clearly. If you compare, the relevant month, August or whatever, with the August before the pandemic, we'll see, calls to our support service are routinely up, 50, 60, 70, 80%, the number of people who are engaging online in our chat forums, who are looking for help. And it's very correlated with lockdowns and the anxiety that comes with lockdowns. And so we've needed to mobilise to serve all of that. But at the same time, we haven't wanted to down tools on some of the longer range projects that have been driving us. One of those is making sure that Australia-wide there is a service that we innovated around and helped design and first trialled and evaluated, called The Way Back. So if someone has tried to take their life and gone to a hospital emergency department, they're not discharged into nothing. They're discharged into a system of support that helps them get through. And then at the other end of the spectrum, something we call New Access, which is a low-intensity coaching model for people who are first getting into trouble. We've wanted to upscale those, so we've been continuing to do that. And we're continuing to do a big refresh of how we do our digital offerings to make sure that we're always at the forefront using the best of this technology. And we've been engaging in the big debates with state and federal governments about the future of the mental health system. One thing we'll certainly be seeing in that future, I think, is more telehealth. We were advocating for telehealth for forever, so people in areas without mental health professionals could still get services. And somehow that was impossible. And then come the pandemic, guess what? It's possible.
Yeah.
So we want to take the best of that with us, but we also want to see a more profound restructuring of the way federal and state governments engage with mental health provision, because there's lots of underservicing and gaps and holes. So they're all of the things that we're doing now. Georgie Harmon, our CEO, and the team at Beyond Blue just do a remarkable job. And given our staff are Melbourne-based and therefore have personally lived through the long Melbourne lockdowns, many of them have got, young kids, so homeschooling, all the rest of it's been part of their world. They've done incredible things.
Wow, that is very incredible how much is being covered there. And like I said, it's such an important time. And I take my hat off to yourself and your team there. And thanks from us. And in particular, great to hear, people like yourselves and the team covering off on all those great, large and strategic and operational levels. And I sort of have this bit of this hypothesis myself, whereby particularly working with so many veterans over the last year in particular, who have gone to and contemplated or engaged with suicidal behaviour, so much of their pathway back has been connecting them back with that community on the ground, connecting them just back with that social interaction, actually establishing relationships with connection, and particularly the actual isolation that has come with this sort of pandemic has really been a large part of that issues. We've really found so many people. Again, I'm on telehealth every second week with my psychologist. It's fantastic, but also just becoming so reliant on just technology being our connection. And when we're able to really look to also integrate getting people together, not clinically, but just communities, like we did back as kids, like we did back in our groups, while working from home is great, but actually getting in and having some form of human intimacy at a connection level is sort of so important. And I'd be interested to see if you guys have had sort of any reflections of that yourselves. I mean, I'm sure the Melbourne crew knows that themselves through living through it, but particularly in the veteran space, we found that to be just sometimes for those who aren't responding clinically, just getting back and around people who they can feel vulnerable around and feel connection around has been some of the best therapy for them.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things we talk about a lot at Beyond Blue is how we think about the mental health workforce. And I think most people would think to themselves, mental health workforce, that'd be psychiatrists and psychologists and psychiatric nurses. And of course, it's all of that. And we love our clinicians and we need our clinicians. But increasingly, it's clear that people are looking for new and different supports. So the importance of peer-to-peer coaching and mentoring, particularly access to someone with lived experience, who's been through it themselves, that can just mean so much to people. And we're thinking about how, Australia could restructure its mental health workforce so that more of that was available for people. So you got access to the right person at the right time, but the right person at the right time might not be a clinician. So I agree with you on all of that. I think that sense of connection, yes, there's the, friends, family, But in terms of talking through these issues, it may well be someone that you access who's been through it. And the Beyond Blue website does offer peer support services, peer chats that I think people find very supportive, and the evidence shows that they do make a difference to people.
Oh, brilliant. Well, I'm very happy to know that you're at the head there with all these causes going on, but none of them more relevant than they've ever been right here and right now. And I thank you for your work, and I thank you for really taking the time to let us know what you and the team are up to, and we look forward to sort of watching more of that. And will you be returning to Australia in the near future when you can to continue that work?
I'm certainly hoping to. I'm very much hoping to get back later in the year. I want to be back to see the Beyond Blue team, obviously, but more than anything else, I want to be back to see family. So fingers crossed that's all works. This is an unpredictable world, so it pays to just think about it as it comes and do what you can, but I am intending to come back later in the year.
Oh, brilliant. Well, Julia, I know you're a very busy lady, and I would really like to thank you personally and professionally for coming on here and having these conversations and just being so authentic and so articulate, and also just so insightful and so much of what you've provided to us today. And if people want to get out there and hear and see more of you, that's not you popping up in the politics, but what you're actually getting on and doing in the real world. How is it best for people to find and engage and access your resources as well as Beyond Blues?
Well, certainly to get on the Beyond Blue website is the best starting point. And then if people need the telephone support service, they'll be guided through to that. For me, if people want to follow what I'm doing, we regularly post on social media, on Twitter and on Facebook, and I've got my website. So they're the easiest ways to see what I'm up to next.
Gotcha. And like we're saying, you've got a podcast of one's own. You'll be continuing that. You are continuing that?
I will.
Oh,
yes,
brilliant.
I will. New episode coming out soon.
Oh, brilliant. Well, thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to now following you with a bit of a renewed information of what's going on. And again, thank you so much for all that you have already done to our country. Thank you for your service. And I do mean that. I highly enjoyed, again, from my first interactions through to subsequent and even now with you. And really appreciate your time today on our podcast.
Lovely to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for listening to this episode. And if you'd like to listen to more, head over to VOAV Podcast on all your favourite streaming outlets. If you'd like to watch more of these episodes, including this one when it's released, head over to the Voice of a Veteran account on YouTube. That is simply Voice of a Veteran on YouTube. For those who would like to follow more on current veteran issues and particularly supporting our veterans, head over to vsf.org.au, vsf.org.au, and that is our website now with resources supporting all veterans and family members. And if you would like to know more or get in contact with myself, please feel free to head to hestonrussell.com or find me on social media. Thanks again and take care.